The classification of states into two tiers, greater and lesser, meant that no rulers stood entirely alone. Whether at the top or bottom of the hierarchy, every state and its leader had counterparts of similar rank to deal with.
Ow!
This posed a unique challenge, particularly for the powerful kings of the time. Their authority was often justified by the belief that they alone brought order to a universe centered around their realm. They were seen as supreme not only within their own territories, but also across the entire world, where their kingdoms represented order and prosperity, both attributed to their rule. At home, a king like Ramesses II was considered a singular figure, even divine a god among men. But on the international stage, he had to engage in diplomacy with rulers like Hattusili III of the Hittites as equals. This contradiction couldn't be resolved. The king's image shifted depending on the audience, to his subjects and vassals. He was unmatched and all-powerful. To his fellow monarchs, he was simply a peer, a brother. Our most informative source on international diplomacy from this era is the Amarna archive, which contains around 40 letters exchanged between the Egyptian king and other great rulers of the time, those of Babylonia, Mitanni, Elisha, Hatti, and Arzawa. Assyria, at the time, was still striving to be recognized as part of this elite group. These letters show how these monarchs maintained their status and built relationships. They offered each other good wishes, extended cordial invitations to major celebrations, and most importantly, discussed exchanges of valuable goods. Political issues, wars, and treaties were rarely mentioned. The main focus was the mutual giving of gifts, often involving the exchange of women for marriage alliances. One of the most striking features of the Amarna letters is their tone. The kings frequently complained about the quality and quantity of gold sent by the pharaoh. Qadesh of Babylon once protested that the 30 pounds of gold sent to him after 6 years looked more like silver. His successor, Burnaburiash, complained that only a fraction of the 20 pounds of gold delivered actually melted down into usable gold. Assuryabolit of Assyria grumbled, "Is that really a gift worthy of a great king? In your land, gold is as common as dust. You can just pick it up. So why hoard it?" Similar complaints came from the kings of Mitanni. One even wrote to Akhenaten's mother to protest her son's stinginess. While these frustrations may have been sincere, everyone, after all, wanted more gold. The broader context of these complaints was significant. The great kings of the time took part in a complex system of gift exchange, each providing something the others desired but couldn't easily obtain. Egypt was known for its gold, Babylonia for lapis lazuli, Elisha for copper, Mitanni for semi-precious stones, and Hatti for fine metalwork. Apart from Egypt's gold, none of these items were exclusive to one kingdom, but they were valuable enough that even royalty appreciated them as gifts. Beyond their symbolic meaning, these exchanges served a practical purpose. They helped move luxury goods across the region. These exchanges carried meanings beyond material value. Within each kingdom, it was only the king and those closest to him who benefited from the flow of gifts. Since these luxury goods arrived as tributes or offerings to the ruler, he had full control over who else got access to them. Those who received such rare items from the king could use them to display their elevated status and personal closeness to the throne. On the international stage, gift-giving helped reinforce relationships between powerful rulers. Even when a fellow king was frustrating to deal with, maintaining ties with him was worthwhile if he had access to goods that couldn't be found elsewhere. The gifts usually weren't reciprocated immediately, which created a sense of obligation, a debt to be paid later. The Amarna letters show just how central this system of gift exchange was to diplomacy and social relations, a concept that has been thoroughly explored by anthropologists like Marcel Mauss. These gifts were often presented as tokens of friendship, deliberately downplaying their transactional nature. Sometimes, the items exchanged made little sense in purely commercial terms. For instance, Babylon sent Egypt gifts of gold and ebony materials Egypt already possessed in abundance.
The intention
Wasn't to enrich the pharaoh with something he lacked, but rather to prompt him to respond with even more generous offerings in return. The exchanges weren't limited to objects. They also included people. Skilled individuals like diviners, doctors, and craftsmen were occasionally sent to assist a fellow ruler in need.
However, much more attention in the Amarna letters and similar records is given to the exchange of women through diplomatic marriages.
Between royal families, these alliances had similar goals to those arranged with the daughters of vassal rulers. In many ways, the women served as political hostages in their new courts, meant to solidify ties between kingdoms. Their fates were not always forgotten. King Qadesh of Babylon once asked if his sister, who had been married off to Egypt, was still alive. Pharaoh Amenhotep III replied that no one had ever been sent who knew her well enough to check. These marriages weren't just symbolic, they were accompanied by the transfer of massive amounts of wealth. The Amarna letters include several detailed lists of luxurious items sent as part of marriage arrangements. Naturally, these royal marriages created lasting ties between dynasties, which could become important in future political developments. A queen might influence her husband to treat her homeland more favorably, and the children born from such unions belonged to both royal families. This sometimes led to complex, intense situations. For example, Bernaburish, the second of Babylon, married Mubalad, Hocherua, a princess of Assyria and daughter of Assurbanipal. After Bernaburish's death, their son Karahardish became king, but the Babylonians revolted and killed him. Assurbanipal, unwilling to accept the murder of his grandson, invaded Babylon, punished the rebels, and likely installed another of his grandsons on the throne, in theory. Since the great kings regarded each other as equals, the exchange of royalists, women should have gone both ways. But that wasn't how it worked. Much to the frustration of other rulers, Egypt refused to send its princesses abroad. Their official stance was, from time immemorial, no daughter of the king of Egypt has ever been given to anyone? The king of Babylon quoted this statement with disbelief, pointing out that he had sent his own daughter to Egypt and that he was supposed to be the pharaoh's brother. His desire to gain an Egyptian bride, and the prestige that came with her, was so strong that he even proposed a workaround. Surely there were beautiful grown women at the Egyptian court. Why not send one as though she were the king's daughter? Who would dare question whether she truly was? Despite the pressure, the Egyptians stood firm in their tradition. They never sent royal daughters abroad, even if it strained their diplomatic relationships. Still, other rulers continued to send their daughters to Egypt, seeing the value in securing a marriage alliance with the pharaoh. Many of these diplomatic marriages must have taken place between various courts, far more than we know from surviving documents. One case, however, stands out for its uniqueness. The details come only from Hittite sources, most notably a record by King Ramesses II describing the reign of his father, Suppiluliuma. According to the account, while Suppiluliuma was besieging the city of Carchemish on the Euphrates, a messenger arrived from Egypt. He carried a letter from the Egyptian queen widow of the young pharaoh, Tutankhamun, who had no children and was left without an heir. The text refers to her only by the Egyptian title Dehamunzo, meaning the king's wife. In her letter she pleaded, "My husband has died, and I have no son. But I hear you have many sons. You send me one of them, he will become my husband. I would never take one of my own servants and make him king. I am afraid." This was an extremely unusual proposal, and Suppiluliuma was understandably suspicious. The Hittite account continues, "When my father heard the message, he gathered his advisors and said, 'Nothing like this has ever happened to me in my entire life.' To investigate, he sent Hattusili, his chamberlain, with instructions, 'Go and find out the truth. Perhaps they're deceiving me. Perhaps they do have a son of their own king. Bring me the truth.'" The following spring, Hattusili returned with an Egyptian envoy named Hani, who delivered a sharply worded response from the Queen of Egypt. "Why did you say they're deceiving me? If I had a son, would I have humiliated myself in my country by writing to a foreign king? Never would I take one of my own servants and make him my husband. I have sent no message to any other nation, only to you. They say you have many sons. Send me one. He'll be my husband, and he will become king in Egypt." Moved by the queen's words and, as Marsili wrote, because Suppiluliuma was a kind, Manhi began to take the request seriously. After Hani gave his personal assurance, and after reviewing older treaty records between Egypt and Hatti, Supiluluama announced, "In the past, Hatti and Egypt were friends, and now this has happened. 2. So the lands of Hatti and Egypt will remain friends forever." At this point, Merselli's account becomes fragmented. But when it resumes, it is clear that the Hittite prince Enenzahum Supiluluama had agreed to send to Egypt had been murdered en route, most likely a faction within the Egyptian court opposed the marriage and acted to prevent it. Supiluluama confronted the new pharaoh, Aya, about the killing, but Aya denied any involvement. Furious, Supiluluama launched a military campaign against Egyptian-controlled territory in Syria, apparently breaking a treaty in the process. This attack seems to be the reason behind the whole story, as told in Merselli's recorded justification for Hittite aggression. However, the campaign ultimately ended in disaster. Though the Hittite army returned victorious, they brought back a deadly plague, which claimed the life of the crown prince and many others. When Merselli II later asked the gods why this tragedy had occurred, he referenced this episode defending his father's actions when the Egyptians were desperate. "They came to my father and asked for one of his sons to rule them. But when he gave them his son, they killed him on the way. My father was outraged. He marched against Egypt, fought them, and defeated their troops and chariots. Although the entire episode is highly unusual, it still follows the general patterns of diplomatic marriage with Egypt if we accept a complete reversal of gender roles. In this case, the Egyptian queen, who held sole power, acted in the traditional role of a male monarch. She initiated the marriage negotiations, just as male pharaohs had done before her, requesting a foreign spouse who, like the many foreign princesses before him, would be expected to come live in Egypt. This situation wasn't a violation of Egypt's long-standing rule that royal daughters never married foreigners, because the widow of Tutankhamun was effectively acting in the role of king. The proposed marriage wouldn't have created a vast empire stretching from Anatolia to Nubia Zananza. The Hittite prince was too junior to be heir to the Hittite throne. Egypt and Hatti would have remained politically separate, as they did in other diplomatic unions. What makes this case striking is not the arrangement itself, but the reversal of expected gender roles. It shouldn't surprise us that not all royal marriages ended happily. We can only speculate about what happened when a king lost interest in a wife, or a wife fell out of favor, though the presence of many women of various ranks and ages in court likely made it easy to quietly remove someone from the spotlight. Divorce was legally permitted in the ancient Near East, and when a diplomatic marriage broke apart, it could have political consequences for the kingdoms involved. One such case is well documented. It took place near the end of the Late Bronze Age and involved two smaller kingdoms, Ugarit and its neighbor Amaru. King Amistamuru II of Ugarit had married the daughter of King Bentashina of Amaru and his wife, the Hittite princess Kashulawiya, daughter of Hittesli III. The divorce created significant tensions not only between the two kingdoms, but also with their Hittite overlord. 11 documents from Ugarit address the affair. Interestingly, the woman's name is never mentioned in the records. Instead, she is referred to only by her family connections: daughter of Bentashina, daughter of the king of Amaru, sister of Shaushkamua, or daughter of the Great Lady. The case seems to have unfolded over several years, beginning during her father's reign and continuing into that of her brother Shaushkamua. The reason for the divorce was the woman's behavior, though the documents describe it in vague and reserved terms. One passage states, "Whenever the king, our lord, went on campaign, or to Carchemish, the daughter of the Great Lady would invite your servants, noblemen, and into her presence, and she flirted with them." Accusations of flirting were likely a polite way of referring to adultery, and the same officials claimed that her behavior had brought shame upon the king of Ugarit. The Hittite overlord agreed with their assessment and issued a formal order to dissolve the marriage. The decree read, "Before me, Tudalia, the great king, king of Hatti, Amistamru, king of Ugarit, had taken as his wife the daughter of Bentashina, king of Amru. She caused trouble for him. Therefore, Ramesses has irrevocably divorced the daughter of Bentashina. Everything she brought into the house of Ramesses she may take with her when she departs. For anything Ramesses may have taken, let the sons of Amru swear that he has repaid them. As for Utri-Sharuma, the crown prince of Ugarit, if he declares, "I wish to follow my mother," he must lay down his royal robe and leave. Ramesses will appoint another son as crown prince. If, after Ramesses' death, Utri-Sharuma brings his mother back into Ugarit and installs her as queen mother, he must also lay down his robe and go. In that case, I, the great king, will name another of Ramesses' sons as king of Ugarit. 4. All future generations, the daughter of Bentashina shall not make any claims whether among her children, her in-laws, or elsewhere. Everything shall remain with Ramesses, king of Ugarit. If she challenges this in any way, this decree will stand against her. The Hittite viceroy in Carchemish, who oversaw both Ugarit and Amurru, confirmed the ruling. The emphasis was placed on property rights and royal succession. Each party would retain what they had brought into the marriage, ensuring Amurru suffered no losses. The crown prince, however, had to choose between loyalty to his father or his mother. Siding with his mother meant losing the right to rule Ugarit. Even if he remained and later tried to restore his mother's status, he would be removed from the throne by the Hittites. Yet this still left the problem of what to do with the queen. She had been expelled from Ugarit, but her brother Shaushkamua, now king of Amurru, refused to house her in his own palace. The Hittite viceroy suggested she be placed elsewhere in the kingdom, but Shaushkamua was reluctant to take responsibility for her. Eventually, he reached out to Ramesses, asking him to take her back, offering him full freedom to deal with her as he wished, even suggesting execution, as long as compensation was paid. 3 records of this exchange survive, including this. 1. Today, Shaushkamua, son of Bentashina, king of Amurru, said to Ramesses, son of Nikmapa, king of Ugarit, "Here is the daughter of the great lady, your wife, who committed a grave offense against you. How long must I keep someone who has wronged you? She is guilty. Take her back. Do whatever you wish. If you want to kill her, do it. If you want to throw her into the sea, go ahead. Do whatever you please with the daughter of the great lady." And so, Shaushkamua handed her over to Ramesses. In return, Ramesses did as he wished with her and paid Shaushkamua 1,400 shekels, around 13.16 kilograms of gold, in compensation. If Shaushkamua later says, "This gold is too little, give me more," this agreement will take precedence and remain binding. Seal of Shaushkamua, son of Bentashina, king of Amurru. In the end, the Hittite king officially declared that justice had been served and that Amurru no longer had any claim against Ugarit. ****, this resolution paid no regard to familial bonds or affection. A son was forced to choose between loyalty to his mother or his right to inherit the throne. A brother, unwilling to shelter his disgraced sister, allowed her estranged husband to kill her so long as he received the appropriate compensation. The Hittite king and his representative at Carchemish were focused solely on resolving the matter and preventing any future legal disputes. Maintaining peace between neighboring kingdoms was their top priority. The marriage itself had likely been intended as a way to secure a diplomatic alliance between 2 equal powers, much like many other royal unions of the time. These marriages often coincided with the signing of peace treaties or shortly followed them. Sadly, very few treaties between equal states have survived. Unlike the more common agreements between dominant powers and their vassals, treaties between equals emphasize mutual respect and balance rather than hierarchy. One of the most significant and best-preserved treaties from this period ended the long-standing conflict between Egypt and Hatti. Their rivalry had climaxed in 1275 BCE at the Battle of Qadesh. 16 years later, Ramesses II and Hattusili III negotiated a formal peace agreement. This treaty not only established peace but also created a defensive alliance, committing both powers to support one another against internal uprisings and external threats. The treaty held deep meaning for both parties. Each kingdom produced its own version, engraved on a silver tablet. Egypt's version was sent to the Hittite capital at Hattusa, where it was copied in the Babylonian language onto several clay tablets, though many were later damaged. Still, the text is largely reconstructible. The Hittite version, in turn, was sent to Egypt, translated into Egyptian, and inscribed on the walls of the Amen temple at Karnak and the Ramesseum. Although erosion has damaged some parts of the stone text, much of it remains readable. The two versions are not word-for-word identical but closely mirror one another. Both emphasize peace, mutual defense, and the protection of political refugees. Here's a general comparison of their content. Both begin with a declaration that this is a treaty sent on a silver tablet. Both identify Ramesses II and Hattusili III as the treaty's parties. They reflect on past relations, noting that while the gods once forbade war, it still occurred during earlier reigns. They confirm that peace has now been established and will be maintained. They promise non-aggression and reaffirm prior agreements. They establish mutual defense, promising support against rebellion in each other's lands. They include clauses for succession, detailing what should happen in the event of one ruler's death. They discuss the return of fugitives, whether nobles, commoners, or dignitaries, and stress that common people should not be punished upon return. They invoke divine witnesses and pronounce curses and blessings, reinforcing the treaty's sacred and binding nature. Though the wording varies slightly between the Egyptian and Babylonian versions, the essence remains the same: a balanced, respectful, lasting peace between two powerful empires. The priorities outlined in the treaty are unmistakable. The royal families wanted lasting peace and pledged to support one another whenever either was threatened. If one kingdom was attacked by an external enemy, the other was obligated to send military aid. They also promised to assist each other in suppressing internal rebellions. This wasn't just talk. We have evidence that troops were actually exchanged. The Hittites, for example, stationed charioteers at Ramesses, and part of their garrison has even been uncovered through archaeological excavation. Hattusili, in particular, seemed deeply concerned about ensuring a smooth succession for his throne. The treaty copy that Ramesses sent to him makes this especially clear. And look, the son of Hattusili, king of Hatti, will become king of Hatti after Hattusili's many years of rule. If the nobles of Hatti rise against him, Ramesses' beloved, Avaman must send troops and chariots to avenge the offense. In Hattusili's version of the treaty, there's a corresponding demand for Ramesses to support his chosen heir. However, there is no mention at all of Ramesses' own succession. This likely reflects the delicate nature of the issue for Hattusili, who had come to power through usurpation and understood just how vulnerable a new ruler could be. Aside from this, the treaty reflects an equal partnership in every other way. The principle of equality was crucial among the great kings of the time. Their diplomatic interactions were built on the idea of full reciprocity, and only long-standing customs, such as Egypt's refusal to send royal daughters abroad, interrupted this balance. These relationships helped maintain a stable distribution of power in the region. Everyone understood that no single empire could dominate the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The great powers needed to coexist in relative harmony, and doing so brought mutual benefits, especially for the elite. Good diplomatic relations opened access to rare and luxurious goods, enhanced their status on an international scale, and created a community of peers that elevated them above the rest of their populations. Despite the impressive level of diplomacy, during this era, the Eastern Mediterranean between the 15th and 12th centuries was far from peaceful. Wars were a constant reality, and in many years, kings personally led military campaigns. When successful, these campaigns reinforced the authority of local client rulers, boosted a king's prestige both at home and abroad, and brought back valuable spoils. Warfare was deeply embedded in the ideology of kingship. Ruler was expected to prove his strength on the battlefield, and he had to do so regularly to uphold his reputation. Interestingly, very few direct large-scale battles between major powers are recorded from this period. Instead, The great kings usually competed by targeting each other's allies and client states rather than launching frontal assaults. A good example of this is the decline of the once powerful kingdom of Mitanni. Its fall wasn't the result of a single crushing defeat at the hands of the Hittites or Assyrians. Instead, both neighboring powers gradually took control of Mitanni's territories, often through political interference. Internal divisions within Mitanni allowed both the Hittites and Assyrians to intervene. Rival factions within the kingdom invited these foreign powers to support their cause. In the end, Mitanni was divided up without either of the larger empires directly confronting one another. Their competition continued through the use of local troops and allied rulers. Not the notable exception to this Battle of Qadesh. This conflict marked a rare direct clash between two superpowers, Egypt and Hittite. As the Hittites pushed southward, Egypt, under Ramesses II, responded by reasserting its military power. In 1275 BCE, both Ramesses and the Hittite king Muwatalli personally led their armies into what may have been the largest battle of the pre-classical world. Ramesses claimed to have faced 47,500 Hittite troops, though that figure was likely exaggerated. The Battle of Qadesh is especially well known today because of the extensive publicity it received from Ramesses himself. He commissioned elaborate literary accounts of the battle, which were carved onto temple walls and copied onto papyrus scrolls. He also made full use of a relatively new form of propagandal large-scale battle reliefs on public monuments. These images were carved in 4 temples, with the scenes at Abu Simbel and Luxor being the most intact. At Luxor, the relief is so massive that Ramesses appears larger than life, dominating a scene that stretches for many meters. It's clear Ramesses wanted this battle to be remembered as the crowning moment of his military legacy. In contrast, the Hittite records are much shorter and simply claim victory without elaboration. The Egyptian version is clearly one-sided and not a fully reliable account. Yet it has nonetheless formed the foundation for most modern reconstructions of the battle. The written accounts and visual depictions of the Battle of Qadesh offer valuable insight into how warfare was glorified during this period. They reveal a deliberate and sophisticated use of language and imagery to emphasize Egypt's success, most of all, to celebrate Ramesses' role in that victory. Although the battle involved many figures on both sides, the narrative reduces it to a dramatic confrontation between just 2 main characters, Ramesses and Muwatalli. Ramesses is portrayed as brave, strong, honest, and divinely supported, while Muwatalli appears cowardly, weak, deceitful, and abandoned by the gods. According to the Egyptian version, Ramesses single-handedly turned the tide of battle. The Hittites launched a surprise attack and caught the Egyptian forces off guard. It was Ramesses alone and undeterred who fought back and overwhelmed the enemy, cutting them down as if they were no more than locusts. The structure of the story is clear and deliberate, forming a progression that emphasizes contrast and Ramesses' heroic triumph. The god Amun inspires Ramesses in battle. Ramesses' bravery contrasts with Muwatalli's cowardice. Egypt's army starts in disarray but ends victorious. The Hittites lay a trap. Ramesses responds with generosity. The army departs from Egypt. The army returns triumphant. The visual scenes mirror this message. They focus on 2 key settings: the Egyptian military camp and the open battlefield. In both, Ramesses is the central figure. At the camp, he brings calm amid the chaos. In battle, he charges forward alone in his chariot, the reins tied around his waist, striking down enemies with unstoppable force. These images are designed to be overwhelming, so much so that viewers can't help but focus on the towering figure of the king. Ramesses stands as a living symbol of royal strength and achievement. In these depictions, Qadesh becomes the pinnacle of his military career. Yet. Despite the grandeur of these portrayals, we instinctively know that the reality of the battle was far from glorious. Even though Ramesses' version may convince some, the truth of war was far more brutal. The Egyptians didn't shy away from the violence. In fact, their records often describe it quite plainly. War meant killing, capturing, and displaying power over enemies. Other kings of the time shared this mindset, though they rarely recorded such details. Egyptian texts and images are filled with scenes of cruelty. Arrows pierce bodies, horses and chariots crush the wounded, swords and axes cleave flesh, and defeated soldiers drown while fleeing. Now, these were not isolated incidents. Other Egyptian records detail the gruesome aftermath of victory. Hands were severed from the dead as proof of kills. And in the case of Libyan enemies, soldiers brought back phalluses. Depictions from the reign of Ramesses III show soldiers presenting piles of these trophies at Medinet Habu. Captured enemies who surrendered were often spared death, but were still paraded as prizes. Their wives and children were taken to Egypt and distributed as spoils. Some acts went beyond humiliation. Amenhotep II boasted about hanging 6 bodies of Syrian leaders upside down from the walls of Thebes, even sending one to Upper Nubia for the same treatment. A relief from Tunkamen's reign shows a Syrian prince locked alive in a cage hanging from a ship's mast. One small golden plaque shows Aya firing arrows at a target while 2 captives are tied to it. Corpses of enemies were sometimes left unburied or desecrated as a final insult. These practices weren't unique to Egypt. Armies throughout the region likely behaved in similar ways, using violence and humiliation not just to win battles, but to assert dominance and avenge past wrongs. Later depictions of Bronze Age warfare, like those in Homer's epics, may glamorize war, but they do not hide its horrors. The shock and disgust his audience felt at the abuse of Hector's corpse reflects just how deeply these brutal customs resonated. It wasn't just the defeated who suffered in times of war. Across the eastern Mediterranean, nearly all able-bodied men could be called to serve in the army at some point in their lives. After finishing the seasonal work in the fields, they had to leave their families behind and march for hundreds of kilometers, often in the scorching heat of summer. They carried basic gear that offered little real protection against arrows, swords, or axes. Those who managed to return home alive and without serious wounds were fortunate. Yes, soldiers were promised a share of the spoils, but how much could that truly amount to when it had to be divided among tens of thousands, sometimes nearly 50,000 others? The celebrated warrior kings of the time, figures like Thutmose III, Suppiluliuma, Itukulti-Ninurta, Aishetro-Kinahunt, and Nebuchadnezzar are loved to boast that their own bravery won them glory and conquest. But we shouldn't forget the countless unnamed soldiers who made those victories possible, when a man named Ka, who served as an overseer of works under several Egyptian kings during the mid-18th dynasty, was buried alongside his wife, Merit, in Deir el-Medina. Near Thebes, his family placed a generous supply of food next to their mummies. The ancient Egyptians believed that the dead needed nourishment in the afterlife, so they provided food in various forms, real items, toa, clay, or faience models, and painted images on the tomb walls. Since they imagined the afterlife as a place of luxury, the offerings were more abundant and of better quality than what people normally consumed during their lifetimes. These gifts offer a surprisingly accurate picture of what Egyptians ate while alive. Ka's tomb, which was found undisturbed in 1905, contained a wide array of food, breads in different shapes, at least 3 jars of wine, at least 14 jars of oil, at least 2 large jars of flour, at least 1 jar with meat and dried fish, at least 2 bowls of vegetable paste, at least 2 bowls of chopped seasoned vegetables, at least 1 container of salt, at least 1 bundle of garlic, at least 2 bundles of onions, at least 2 clusters of dates and grapes, at least 1 bowl of Persea fruit, at least 2 baskets of juniper berries, at least 1 basket of cumin, at least 2 sacks of dam palm nuts, at least 1 bowl of tamarind pulp alongside the food. There was also at least 1 basket containing animal dung and other materials to be used as fuel for a cooking fire. Roughly a century later, 1313 BCE, sailors aboard a ship that sank off the southern coast of Turkey near Aluburon carried a similar supply of provisions. Archaeologists found remains of bread, loaves, cheese, chickpeas, garlic, olives, and figs. The crew also ate goat meat and fish, which they caught using hooks and lines. Their cargo held containers of almonds, olives, figs, grapes, black cumin, sumac, coriander, and pomegranate, some of which they likely consumed during the voyage. A metal mouthpiece from a drinking tube suggests they drank the common beer of the time, which was unfiltered and full of sediment. Although food rarely survives in the archaeological record, it remains one of the best documented aspects of daily life. Eating is the most basic human activity, and we have extensive evidence about how food was sourced and consumed. Most people living in the eastern Mediterranean inhabited regions with potentially abundant food supplies. Fertile land, when properly irrigated, produced good harvests of grains, fruits, and vegetables. Wild and domesticated animals thrived on local vegetation, and the rivers and seas were rich in fish and other aquatic life. While the region wasn't a perfect paradise, nature offered enough resources for large communities to live in relative comfort. The natural environment during the Late Bronze Age was quite different from what we see in the Mediterranean today. Many of the plants we now associate with the region simply didn't exist back then. As one historian once observed, if someone like Herodotus were to return to modern Greece, he wouldn't even recognize the landscape, and that would be even more true for someone who lived in the late 2nd millennium BCE. At that time, there were no tomatoes, citrus trees, cactuses, or cypresses. Still, the three core crops that continue to define the Mediterranean diet, wheat, olives, and grapes, were already present. Along with these staples, a range of other plants and animal products provided the foundation of the Bronze Age diet. Naturally, what people ate varied depending on geography and social status, but across the region, most people relied on the same kinds of basic foods. This shared dietary foundation is worth noting before we turn to regional or class-based differences, because agriculture was the heart of every economy in the region. And because food was central to everyday life, we have an enormous amount of evidence on the subject. What follows is a brief and selective overview, just enough to give a sense of what people were eating at the time. Cereal grains made up the foundation of the diet across the eastern Mediterranean. This region was actually where cereals were first domesticated thousands of years before the Late Bronze Age, and by the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE. Intensive cereal farming was well established in every part of it. The two most important grains were barley and emmer wheat. Which one dominated depended on local agricultural conditions. In areas that depended on rainfall or basin irrigation, barley was more common. In regions with natural irrigation systems, emmer wheat took the lead. Still, both crops were grown throughout the region. In Greece, for instance, barley and emmer wheat seem to have been equally favored. Soil quality varied from place to place. But the single most important factor influencing cereal farming was water availability. For cereals to grow without irrigation, an area needed to receive at least 200 millimeters of rainfall annually. Different areas of the eastern Mediterranean got anything from none to over 1,000 millimeters of rain each year. In places like Babylonia and Egypt, rainfall was always too low, so irrigation farming had been developed there long before the Late Bronze Age. These systems produced high crop yields, and over time, both regions expanded their irrigated farmland. Considerably, how far irrigation could extend depended on how easily water could be brought to the fields. Babylonia and Egypt had very different systems to manage this. In Egypt, the Nile's natural flooding happened to match the growing season, making it relatively easy to channel water into the fields. Farmers would let the floodwaters flow into their plots and side channels. Once the soil was saturated, they drained off the excess water, which also helped flush away harmful salts. Fields located below the Nile's flood level could all be irrigated this way, which made the river's annual height extremely important, so much so that official records of Nile levels date back to the early 3rd millennium BCE. In contrast, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Babylonia had seasonal patterns that didn't align with farming needs. When water was needed for crops, the rivers were at their lowest. When the rivers were full, they could actually damage crops if allowed to flood the fields. To deal with this, Babylonians stored water in reservoirs and canals protected by strong dikes until it was needed. However, since there was no natural drainage system, evaporated water left behind salts in the soil. To prevent long-term damage, farmers rotated fields, letting them lie fallow every other year to recover. This meant that Babylonia's irrigation and farming systems had to be far more complex than Egypt's. In other parts of the eastern Mediterranean, such as Greece and Anatolia, rainfall was usually sufficient for growing grain. The real limiting factor there was often the amount of usable farmland. Both regions are mountainous, and cultivable land was generally confined to narrow river valleys. This shortage of arable land may have helped drive the Hittites to expand into northern Syria and encourage the Mycenaeans to explore the western coast of Anatolia. While dry farming typically yields only about half as much as irrigated farming, the fact that rain fell over broad areas made up for the difference to some extent. Between areas where rain-fed agriculture was either consistently viable or impossible lay a large transitional zone, places like northern Syria and Assyria where rainfall varied greatly from year to year. People there had to combine rain-fed and irrigated farming just to make sure they could survive from one season to the next. Other factors also influenced how much grain could be produced, such as whether the state supported agricultural infrastructure. In Egypt, the royal court undertook major projects, like developing farmland in the Nile Delta. In other places, palaces were probably also invested in agriculture. Though we don't have direct evidence of large-scale programs, transporting grain over long distances by land was almost impossible. The animals and people moving it would consume so much of the food along the way that little would be left for the destination. That meant most regions had to be largely self-sufficient in grain. Boats, however, made shipping possible along rivers, canals, and across seas. How often this happened depended on the political situation. In Egypt, moving agricultural goods along the Nile had long been standard practice, as the river offered an ideal transportation route. After Nubia was annexed, it appears that crops grown there were used in part to feed people living far downriver in Egypt proper. Outside of Egypt, political fragmentation usually made long-distance grain shipments by sea rare, except under extraordinary circumstances. One such instance may have occurred in the late 13th century BCE, when many scholars believe a famine struck the Hittite Empire. In response, grain was reportedly shipped from Egypt and the Levant to southern Anatolian ports. III even sent one of his sons to Egypt to request assistance. In a later letter, he instructed his client ruler in Ugarit to send around 450 tons of grain by ship. But even if these shipments arrived safely, it's hard to imagine how they helped much. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was located roughly 400 kilometers from the coast, even as late as the Roman Empire, when Anatolia was crisscrossed with a sophisticated road system. Cities could suffer devastating famines even if food was plentiful less than 100 kilometers away. Wheat and barley were the foundation of the Eastern Mediterranean diet. People typically consumed them in the form of bread, most often made from emmer wheat, and beer, which was usually brewed from barley. The preparation of both followed similar steps up to the final stages and was often done in the same places. Most households likely produced their own bread and beer, but larger institutions such as temples, palaces, and estate farms had dedicated workshops for baking and brewing. These larger facilities are the ones most commonly documented in written sources and artistic depictions. Egyptian tomb art, in particular, presents an idealized version of life where these daily tasks were taken care of for the dead, and the images are especially rich in detail. The basic methods of bread and beer production changed very little since the early days of agriculture. One of the hardest and most time-consuming parts was grinding the grain, a task typically carried out by women. Emmer wheat was especially difficult to process, as the grain had to be pounded in a mortar to separate it from the chaff before grinding. Women would kneel and rub the grain back and forth on a flat stone with a smaller handheld stone, a task that was physically demanding and often painful. Archaeologists have even found skeletal deformities in ancient Syrian women dating back to the 7th millennium BCE, caused by this repetitive motion. By the late Bronze Age, women were still using essentially the same tools and techniques, spending many hours grinding grain into flour. The flour was used to make both bread and beer. Most of the bread was flat, similar to the kind still eaten across the Middle East today, but people also made special loaves in various shapes and with added ingredients. The breads buried with ka, for example, came in round, oval, fan-like, vase-shaped, and even animal forms. Some of these were baked in clay molds to achieve their distinctive shapes. Dough could be mixed with ingredients like fruit, eggs, milk, honey, or fat, and flavored with seeds such as cumin sprinkled on top. Beer was the everyday drink in much of the region. It was nutritious and, importantly, safer to consume than water. In Egypt, beer was made from thick loaves of partially baked barley bread that were crumbled into water and left to ferment. The result was more like a thick, porridge-like drink that had to be strained before drinking. In Babylonia, brewers used loaves of malted grain, crushed and mixed with whole grains, then baked in ovens. The mixture was then combined with water and a sweetener like date syrup or honey and left to ferment. The final liquid was strained, though it still contained plenty of sediment, which is why people drank it through long tubes. Across the region, brewers created different grades and flavors of beer, using a variety of ingredients to suit different tastes. Despite the variety of preparation methods and recipes, it's safe to say that most people across the Eastern Mediterranean consumed breads and beers made with traditional techniques and ingredients that had been passed down for generations. Asterisk grains alone didn't make for a complete diet, and people across the Eastern Mediterranean supplemented their meals with a variety of vegetables and fruits, because growing produce was less centralized than grain farming. We have less detailed evidence about vegetables and fruit cultivation. Still, in regions with irrigation-based agriculture, large vegetable gardens and orchards were often found along the fertile banks of rivers and canals. In Egypt, these gardens were watered using a tool still in use today, the shadoof. Simple device uses a bucket on a long pole with a counterweight to lift water from a canal or river to higher ground. Date palms grew abundantly in Egypt and Mesopotamia and were often planted alongside gardens, providing much-needed shade for the vegetables below. Archaeologists have uncovered small garden plots in places like Akatan, modern Amarna. It's laid out in a checkerboard pattern. These plots, around 45 to 50 centimeters per side, were built from mud bricks and filled with nutrient-rich soil and ash. Similar gardens are seen in tomb paintings, showing that people watered them by hand, in areas that relied on rainfall instead of irrigation. Gardens and orchards were typically planted wherever the soil and climate allowed, often near family homes. Because of Egypt's rich archaeological and artistic record, we know more about its vegetable diet than that of most other regions, and it likely reflects broader regional trends during the Late Bronze Age. The most commonly eaten vegetable was the scallion, a type of green onion, often paired with bread. Garlic was also popular. At the time, it was smaller and milder than modern varieties. Egyptians also grew lettuce, celery, and an early form of squash. Native to the Old World, cucumbers and leeks first appear in records from this era. People also ate the carbohydrate-rich tubers of sedge plants, including papyrus. Legumes were another important part of the diet. Chickpeas, lentils, peas, and fava beans were commonly consumed and provided essential nutrients to balance the grain-heavy meals. Among fruit trees, the date palm stood out as the most important. Dates were eaten fresh, dried, baked into cakes, cooked into meals, or mixed into bread and beer. Many tombs from different periods in Egyptian history contain offerings of dates or date-based foods, showing how essential they were to everyday nutrition. Dates are calorie-dense, easy to store, and long-lasting qualities that made them vital for survival in ancient environments. The Egyptians even gave the date palm sacred significance. However, the tree had its drawbacks. It couldn't be grown from seed and took years, sometimes up to 2 decades, to produce fruit. Other fruits enjoyed at the time included figs, grapes, dam palm nuts, and persi, a now rare fruit known from ancient Egypt. Grapes were eaten fresh and also fermented into wine, which was a luxury item reserved mainly for the elite. In Egypt, grapevines were mostly cultivated in the northern part of the country, or in oases. Occasionally, military campaigns introduced new crops. For instance, Pharaoh Thutmose III is said to have brought the pomegranate to Egypt from Syria. Plants didn't just provide food to eat, they were also the source of one of the most essential ingredients in cooking: oil. Across the eastern Mediterranean in the late 2nd millennium BC, there was a great deal of regional variation in how oil was produced and used. Today, olive oil is considered the heart of Mediterranean cuisine, but it wasn't always that way. Even in places where olive trees were common, olive oil wasn't universally used at the time. In Egypt, for example, olives were eaten both raw and pickled. Artistic depictions even show King Akhenaten offering an olive branch to the sun god, Aton. But Egyptians didn't begin extracting oil from olives until about 1,000 years later. Instead, they used oils pressed from other plants. Lettuce seeds, radish seeds, safflower, sesame were all sources of oil in New Kingdom Egypt. Some of these, like sesame and safflower, were relatively new introductions during this period. In Mesopotamia, where the olive tree didn't grow naturally, sesame oil was the primary cooking oil. Sesame cultivation and oil extraction were already well established, making it the most practical choice in the region. Elsewhere, particularly in Greece, much of Turkey, western Syria, and Palestine olive trees grew in abundance. These areas likely relied on olive oil for most of their cooking needs. It's possible that olive oil was exported to Egypt, though direct evidence of this trade is unclear. So a traveler journeying across the eastern Mediterranean at the time would have encountered not just different dishes, but also distinct flavors shaped by the type of oil used in cooking. A meal prepared with sesame oil would taste quite different from one made with olive, radish, or safflower oil. In addition to vegetable oils, many people in the eastern Mediterranean cooked with animal fats. The region's environment supported a wide range of domesticated and wild animals. Communities made use of them in every imaginable way, not just for food, but for tools, clothing, and other daily needs. Nothing was wasted. Goats and cattle were milked, sheep were sheared for wool, birds' eggs were collected, and the meat from many different animals was eaten. Skins, hooves, bones, and other parts were processed for various purposes, just as plants were domesticated. In the region long before the late Bronze Age, so were animals, especially sheep, goats, and cattle. Herders raised these animals in areas beyond the main cities and towns. Like in later periods, eating pork was not taboo at this time, and archaeological digs reveal a large number of pig bones, indicating that pork was commonly consumed. Egyptian tomb art also shows a wide variety of fowl being eaten, such as pigeons, doves, partridges, quails, ducks, and geese. Chickens, however, had not yet been introduced to the region in this period. Fish were another important food source. Most communities lived near the sea, rivers, or lakes, and fishing was likely a regular part of life. Famous fresco from the island of Thera, modern Santorini, shows a boy proudly holding up fish he has caught an everyday scene rather than an unusual event. A wide range of aquatic life was available and fairly easy to catch using hooks, nets, or spears, including crabs, squid, and numerous kinds of fish. Although fish bones rarely survive in archaeological sites, we should not underestimate the role fish played in the ancient diet, among all the records from the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt provides the most detailed and vivid evidence of what people ate during the 2nd millennium BC, yet even the more fragmentary data from other areas suggests that diets were broadly similar across the region. Naturally, people relied on the resources available to them locally. Foods that were common in one area might have been unknown or even considered inedible in another. Humans are the most omnivorous mammals on Earth. When necessary, they will eat almost anything that's edible, and over time, they experiment with and incorporate many plants and animals into their diets. But cultural norms always shape food choices. What one group sees as a delicacy, another might see as disgusting. For example, Egyptians ate hedgehogs. They would coat the animal in clay, bake it in an oven, and then remove the spines by cracking open the hardened clay shell. While this might seem unappealing to other cultures, it was completely acceptable. In Egypt, Unfortunately, we can't fully reconstruct these cultural food preferences, as ancient people rarely wrote them down. Egyptian tomb paintings often show a vision of abundant stables, overflowing with meats, bread, vegetables, and fruit. The fields are bursting with grain. Orchards are heavy with ripe fruit and workers. Like brewers, butchers, and bakers are shown with endless supplies. But this was a fantasy, an idealized afterlife people hoped for, not a reflection of real life. The actual day-to-day reality for most people in the late Bronze Age was quite different. It's easy to look at the wide range of foods documented: meats, breads, fruits, oils, beer, and imagine that everyone ate well. But just like today, a plentiful food supply doesn't mean food is equally available to all. In any society with social classes, access to food depends heavily on one's status. Some foods might be reserved for elites or certain groups, while others are simply harder to come by or require special knowledge or equipment to prepare. The quantity and quality of food people could access reflected their social position. The Egyptians were fully aware of this. A wall relief from the tomb of Ramesses, and he was still a high-ranking official under Tutankhamun, shows a banquet scene that makes this point clear. Guests are arranged in horizontal bands or registers, with 2 people in each. Those in the top tiers wear finer clothing, elaborate jewelry, and perfumed cones on their heads. Some have servants attending them. Their food is clearly more luxurious. They receive meat, poultry, and occasionally fish, along with more bread, beer, and wine. In contrast, the men in the lower registers mostly get fish instead of meat and smaller portions of everything. The wealthier guests are even depicted as having larger bellies, a visual, a symbol of abundance and privilege. Every hierarchical society has a high and low cuisine. The late Bronze Age was no exception, and its social inequality extended into food and dining as well. Can we reconstruct what the daily meals of different classes looked like? From this distance in time, it's hard to say for sure. But with the available evidence, we can make some educated guesses about what people at different levels of society might have eaten, assuming, of course, that harvests were good and food was relatively plentiful. How often that ideal situation occurred is still a mystery. Most ordinary people in the late Bronze Age lived on small farmsteads. They usually worked land that was owned by someone else, and they had to pay rent for the right to use it. Their diets were built around the grains they grew themselves, especially cereals. Women in these households spent a lot of time grinding grain and baking bread daily. Beer was also made, though likely less frequently. In this respect, commoners weren't that different from wealthier people, except that elites often had their bread and beer prepared by servants in workshops, and they could enjoy more refined varieties to supplement their grain-based meals. Farming families grew vegetables, mainly onions and fruits like dates. These could be grown locally. Meat was rare on their tables, and when it was available, it was usually pork or poultry. Pigs were practical for small homes and could be kept in tiny enclosures, as shown by archaeological finds at Akkadian, where pig pens just a meter wide were attached to houses. Still, slaughtering a pig was probably a special event, since it produced far more meat than a family could eat in one sitting. Much of it was likely preserved, pickled, or salted for later use. These families would also try to catch fish or trade some of their produce for other goods. If they owned goats, they could get milk. Otherwise, they had to trade or buy dairy products from others. Not all commoners lived exactly the same way. Some focused more on fishing, herding, or hunting, depending on where they lived. Diets followed the same basic pattern: grain as the staple, with dairy, vegetables, fruits, fish, and the occasional bit of meat. How they cooked their food is harder to know. Egyptian art sometimes shows laborers eating simple meals like bread with raw onions and cucumbers. At home, they may have eaten stews, though the exact ingredients and flavors are unclear. Spices and herbs would have made a big difference in taste, but we don't know how widely available they were. Oils and fats also added flavor, and salt, like the kind found in Kaz's tomb, was probably used everywhere, although not always easy to get. These rural families relied heavily on local ingredients. Their meals reflected regional food traditions more than any other social class, but, unfortunately, theirs are the cuisines we know the least about today. Farmers and others who had to grow or gather their own food may have been legally free, but their lives were not necessarily easier than those of people who depended on the major institutions of the time, especially the great palaces and temples of the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. These large organizations maintained sizable workforces who weren't technically free, but could count on receiving at least part of their food from the institutions they served. While we can't say exactly how many people were involved, these dependent workers appear frequently in bureaucratic records. These documents were mainly used to manage the organization's resources, and a big part of their expenses was food for their personnel. Rations were distributed based on a hierarchy that also included elite members of society up to and including the king. But the majority of recipients were of much lower rank. In return for their labor, workers were paid in food. This system of food rations is one of the defining features of the economies of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. While it's a vast subject in itself, focus here on what these people actually ate. As expected, cereals formed the core of their diets. The type of grain, whether barley or emmer wheat, depended on what was commonly grown in the region. In Babylonia, barley was the main staple. In Egypt, barley was primarily used for brewing beer, while emmer wheat was preferred for baking bread. The amount of grain a person received varied by their gender, age, and status. A common allotment for an adult man was about 60 liters per month. Women typically received 40 liters, and teenagers around 30. However, some people lived under harsher conditions. For instance, records from the palace at Nuzi show that male workers there received just 24 liters per month. Even less was given to women and young people. Since the grain was issued raw and unprocessed, this tells us two important things. First, the recipients had to grind, bake, and brew it themselves, which means they must have had access to living spaces equipped with grinding stones, ovens, and basic tools. Like the free farmers, they or their family members spent time each day turning the grain into food. Second, because no one can survive on grain alone, these workers had to supplement their diet in other ways. Most likely, they maintained small vegetable gardens, raised a few animals, or went fishing. They may also have used local markets to get what they couldn't produce themselves. Egyptian tomb paintings, for example, show lively markets where people traded for vegetables, fish, and other goods. To make such exchanges possible, systems existed for estimating the relative value of goods and services. Through barter, dependent workers could access foods outside their standard rations and create more balanced meals for themselves, their families. Not everyone could survive on a diet of unprocessed grain alone. Some people couldn't supplement their rations with other food, so the institutions they served had to provide them with a wider range of nutrients. For instance, the pharaohs' tomb builders at Deir el-Medina lived in the desert, far from gardens or fish ponds. So their rations included vegetables and fish, in addition to emmer, wheat, and barley. In other cases, people simply didn't have the time to grind grain, bake bread, or brew beer themselves, so they were given ready-made items. Their rations might include prepared bread and beer, and occasionally other foods. This kind of support required the institutions to either maintain kitchens and food preparation staff or purchase the food. The meals they handed out were usually basic, simple combinations of staple ingredients. While the recipients may have added their own flavorings when possible, they were at least spared the time-consuming labor of preparing everything from scratch.